Are we gonna, do we need to get anything on before we call the juror? I mean, I think she's got an expert that is gonna testify next, I think. No. A witness. Okay, and then, okay. Is there anything we need to put on the record before we call either of them?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Now I'll get to your.
You want me to, Jeff? All right. Alan, do you still want 40?
All rise.
Thank you, Sheriff. You all may be seated. We recall that we're in the defendant's case. Call your next witness, please. Officer Embry. Sure. Come on up, Your Honor. Members of the jury, if you would like to go with the sheriff. All rise for the jury. Y'all may be seated. If you could please raise your right hand. You swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth?
Yes, sir.
Please have a seat. We're here because this witness is an expert witness. According to Mr. Prosper, we're offering him as an expert, so we're outside the presence of the jury. For this proffer.
State your name, please.
Hang on just a second, because I need to just tell you on something. When I asked you if we needed to call the jury, or if we needed to have any other hearings, or any other matters that we need to take up, I meant it. So please, in the next time that you have a witness, and you need the court's time, and you think that there may be a necessity for a hearing on the rules of evidence, in particular, those that are related to expert witnesses, please do let me know. Okay? Both sides. Everybody understood?
Yes.
Both sides.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
Judge, I just want to say for the record that I just informed the defense that this particular witness is currently on our pending, the DA's office pending Brady list. I don't plan on going into any of that or impeaching him on that. Just want them to be aware of that and say that for the record.
Go ahead, Mr. Prosecutor.
I'd like to point out to the court that he has been on their expert witness list, so.
Do you have any disagreement with his qualifications?
No, Your Honor, it's
Okay.
more as to the work that he did in this case.
All right, so then we can skip that part. He's qualified as an expert. Let's get to what his opinion is, what it's based on, and we can go from there.
There would be other questions I would want to ask him when I call him. You tell him to skip past those and get to what they've asked him.
Yes, sir. As I understand it, you're calling him as an expert witness, right?
Correct.
For measurements and speed? No.
And the manner in which the vehicle is being driven.
Okay, so for those couple of things, you can question the witness. Go ahead. Just what his opinions are, and what they're based on, and we'll be good.
State your name, please, sir.
Ernest Embry.
Okay, and you are employed by the Dallas County Sheriff's Department?
Yes, sir.
And prior to being employed by the Dallas County Sheriff's Department, were you employed elsewhere?
As a police officer, no.
Okay, so the only law enforcement experience that you've had is with the Dallas County Police Department?
Yes,
Dallas
sir.
County Sheriff's Department?
Yes, sir.
How long have you been employed?
28 years.
And in what capacity?
20, I've been a deputy for 25 years, and I've been a detective in vehicle crimes unit for about 19.
During that time period, have you been called upon by the district attorney's office to testify as a witness?
Yes,
On few or many occasions?
few.
Okay. And have they sponsored you?
Yes.
They called you to the
Ye-
witness stand?
Yes,
And urged juries or fact finders to embrace your testimony?
yes,
Now, have they on occasion asked you to perform certain tasks on their behalf?
yes,
On few or many occasions?
a few.
Okay. And have they done so for what reason? What area of expertise do you have that causes them to seek you out and say, hey, man, we need a favor?
Crash reconstruction. Crash reconstruction,
Okay. And are you qualified as an expert in that area?
yes,
Okay. And have you done so and testified on their behalf previously?
I believe so.
And they asked you to perform a function for them. In this case, did they not?
Yes,
Okay. And did you do so?
yes,
And did you do so with an investigator from the district attorney's office?
yes,
Did you go out to the scene of this particular incident at Eastgate
yes,
apartment complex?
yes,
And did they show you pictures?
yes,
Did they show you body cams?
yes,
Did you have an opportunity prior to giving an opinion or rendering a report to see the body cam of the incident in this question?
yes,
Did you see more than one?
yes,
You had an ample opportunity to observe the manner in which that vehicle was being driven, did you not?
yes,
Did you attempt, with the aid of the district attorney's office investigator, to take measurements and in some way, manner, or form utilize those measurements in conjunction with viewing the video to attempt to calculate a speed?
yes,
And did you do so?
yes,
And did you give those speeds to the district attorney's office?
yes,
Do you remember, and the judge, I guess what I'll do, instead of referring to this as a grand jury hearing, refer to it as a previous forum.
Okay.
At a previous hearing, did the district attorney's office call you and ask you to testify with regards to the purpose for which they sought out your opinion?
yes,
And prior to doing so, did they thank you for your previous service that you've rendered at their request and on their behalf?
yes,
And did they tell you, we always appreciate and trust your work?
yes,
They told you that. And did you answer questions thereafter from both them and members of the grand jury?
yes,
Well, you asked specifically, you have a 2,000-pound car hitting someone at 6 miles an hour could cause grievous injury. Will you ask that question?
yes.
And what was your answer?
I answered that, yes, that it could.
Now, my question to you is, if the speed had been 5 miles an hour, is that vehicle capable of causing death or serious bodily injury?
Yes,
How about 2 miles an hour?
yes,
And what do you base that opinion on? Your experience?
yes, sir,
Your observation of this vehicle and the manner in which it was driven?
yes, sir,
Do you remember being asked the following question? But I'm asking you generalities. Is that the kind of speed, let me just put it like this, is that the kind of speed that this vehicle was exhibiting, the vehicle that you observed in the body cam, going to be typically the kind that would alarm an officer, just generally speaking? You remember being asked that question?
yes,
You remember what your answer was?
yes.
And what is your answer?
I said, yes, it would be.
And do you remember them asking you, okay, in what way?
No, but,
You don't
Yeah.
dispute being asked that question?
no, I don't
Do
dispute.
you remember responding, I mean, it's presenting a danger? Do you remember that being your answer?
Yes,
Is that accurately describe your feeling and your observations of viewing that video and that vehicle that was being driven on that day and that occasion?
yes, sir,
Now, and did they thank you for your testimony?
yes, sir,
And you remember being asked the following question. But I think it's probably fair to say at the moment in time shots were fired, the officer doesn't take into consideration a blunt impact versus he sees a clear and present danger in his mind. You remember being asked that?
yes,
You remember what your answer was?
no,
You remember telling him that's correct. He sees a clear and present danger.
yes,
And that's because of the manner in which the vehicle was being driven.
yes, sir.
But that's the areas that I'm planning. Since then, they haven't contacted you since this testimony, other than to be here today, basically?
I think I have been one time, yes.
Okay. But they haven't consulted you any more about your opinion or your findings or anything of that nature?
No.
That's what I'm planning on going into.
Mr. Lewis?
Thank you, Your Honor. Just a few questions. Detective Embry, if I understood during examination correctly, you intend to offer opinions as to whether or not a motor vehicle at those speeds that you determine could cause serious bodily injury or death to someone. Is that what I understand?
Yes.
Okay. Do you also intend to testify about the actual calculations that you did?
Yes.
Have you been asked to do that?
No.
Okay. So are you going to be testifying in the field of expertise of use of force?
No.
All right, so as pertains to the calculations that you did, can you describe for the court how you actually did those calculations?
Yes, myself and the DA investigator went to the complex, and I noticed that there's a white lattice fence, kind of like as the officers were facing, it was back off to the left or in front of them. And I noticed that it had pickets periodically, like holding the lattice up. So we measured those. We measured the distance between those pickets, or those standards.
Okay, and how did you come to velocities, the velocity that you came up with?
I used, as the vehicle was in motion, I had a point somewhere on the car that I could see it start at one of the pickets and end at the next one, and I used a stopwatch to time that, how long it took that for the car to go that distance.
So you visually used your eyes on a stopwatch to determine time?
Yes.
Okay. And then as far as distance, I believe you testified that you went out to the scene and what did you use to measure the fence with?
A tape measure.
A tape measure. And based upon those methods, that's how you came to the velocity calculations that you came to in this case?
Yes, sir.
With regard to velocity determinations, when it comes down to video, would you say that this is the most reliable or accurate way to do that?
No.
Okay. Would you agree with me that if you're using a stopwatch, there may be some human error as it goes to determining time by using your eyes on a stopwatch?
Yes.
Okay. And the same with the distance. As far as the fence panels, how many did you measure?
I can't remember exactly how many we measured.
Okay, but as far as what you visually looked at in the video, did you go out and measure all the panels to make sure that they were the exact same size?
As far as I think we did, yes.
Okay. But you would agree with me again, based upon the method in which you used in this case, that it's not the most accurate and reliable way to do that. Is that correct?
Yes.
In fact, it may not even be reliable at all. I mean, would you agree with me that if we use like a laser scan to determine exact measurements, that would be more accurate than the method that was used in this particular case?
Yes.
All right, thanks, sir.
All right. Are you, Mr. Prosperi, going to ask him how many miles an hour was this car going? Nothing like that? All right, this is what I'm going to let you get into. I'm going to let you get into that the car could cause injury, that a car going between 2 and 5 miles an hour could cause serious bodily injury. I'm not going to let you get into any velocity calculations. There was some of the questions you asked said something like, did the state say we always appreciate your work and thank you for your testimony? And I'm not going to let you get into any of that. There's no need to editorialize. The witness's opinion about the use of that car, given his experience, I'll let you testify about that, but that's it. Unless George has an objection.
We respect the court's ruling, but we would object on Rule 403 if they've already had an expert witness testify to this, and we would state that it's cumulative evidence at this point.
Objection's overruled. I'll give you a running objection to that. Call the jury.
I'll call. Go ahead, Sheriff. You ready? Let's do it. Go ahead, Sheriff.
All rise.
Thank you, Sheriff. Y'all may be seated. You raise your right hand for me, please. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth?
Yes, sir.
Very good. You may proceed, Mr. Prosper.
Sir, would you state your name, spell your last name for the court reporter, and keep your voice up loud enough so the last two ladies on the jury can understand everything that you're saying?
Yes, sir. Ernest Embry, E-M-B-R-Y.
And I take it by your uniform, you are a peace officer?
Yes, sir.
And who do you work for?
The Dallas Sheriff's Department,
And how long have you worked there?
28 years.
I want to make one thing perfectly clear. You and I have never talked about this case prior to today, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you were employed by the district attorney's office in this case years ago, were you not?
No.
They asked you to go out and perform
Oh,
a
yes,
task
yes,
in
yes.
relation to this case.
Yes,
So they
yes.
commissioned you to go out and help them in regards to the investigation of this case, did they not?
Yes, sir.
And you have testified on their behalf before,
Yes, sir.
and so you went out and did what they asked you to do.
Yes, sir.
And you have testified at a previous hearing on this matter at their behalf, did they not?
Yes, sir.
They sponsored your testimony and expertise, did they not?
Yes, sir.
Now, let me ask you, as part of the task that you performed in this case, did you view the body cam videos of this incident that occurred on January the 18th, 2017?
Yes, sir.
Did you have an opportunity to observe the manner in which the vehicle that's the subject matter here was being driven?
Yes, sir.
And were you asked at this hearing, were you called by the district attorney's office?
Yes.
And were you asked questions by the district attorney's office in regards to this incident?
Yes, sir.
That's overruled.
Okay. Did you go out to that scene to do what you did accompanied by a district attorney's office investigator?
Yes, sir.
Overruled.
That calls for a yes or no answer. You
Yes,
didn't
sir.
answer that question.
Yes, sir.
Okay. He went out there with you.
Yes, sir.
And he assisted you in your duties and responsibilities on that day, did you
Yes.
not?
Yes, sir.
And how long were you out there?
I would say an hour, maybe.
Okay. And did you report back to the district attorney's office at the end of your duties and investigation?
Yes, sir.
And do you remember being asked at that hearing whether or not a 2,000-pound car hitting someone could cause grievous injury?
Object to leading, Your Honor.
Oh, I'm going to overrule it.
Yes, sir.
Do you remember being asked that question?
Yes, sir.
And what was your answer?
My answer was yes, it could.
Do you remember being asked this question, officer? Is the kind of speeds that this vehicle was exhibiting going to be typically the kind that would alarm an officer, just generally speaking? You remember being asked that question?
Yes.
And what was your answer?
Yes, it would be alarming.
And you were talking about this incident in the parking lot at the time?
Yes, sir.
Ask the witness.
One moment, Your Honor. No questions for this witness, Your Honor.
Sir, you may stand down. You're excused from any further service.
Thank
Call
you,
your
sir.
next witness, please.
And ladies and gentlemen of the jury, at this time, the defense calls Jerry Staton.
If you would please, before you have a seat on the witness stand, raise your right hand. Swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth.
I do, Your Honor.
Please have a seat. Responding to questions from Ms. Madsen? Ms.
Yes,
Madsen?
Your Honor.
And perhaps also Ms. Nicholson. Very good. Thank you. Whenever you're ready and situated, you may proceed.
Sir, will you introduce yourself to the jury, please?
Good afternoon. My name is Jerry Staton, and I'm a retired police officer out of Austin, Texas. Staton.
Tell the jury a little about your training and experience in your career in law enforcement.
As with most police officers, I went through the academy there at Austin, which was about a 6-month training academy. After coming out of the academy, as normal, rode with another officer for a period of time, then was released on my own, worked the first 5 years in uniform patrol, responding to calls for assistance and working traffic and so forth. After that 5-year period, I took a test and was promoted to what they now refer to as detective. That they changed the names a couple of times, but essentially the next step up on the chain. And at the time, they were starting a new program where the detectives in the past had always been sent into the building to do investigative work. We call it driving a desk. The new program that they were experimenting with left a detective out on the street. So I remained on the street, assigned to a patrol shift, but not wearing a uniform most of the time, where I was in plain clothes. And without going into detail, it was a program designed to try to improve crime scene investigations and get major crimes a little better start when there wasn't a detective from that bureau available. So it was the initial investigation. Excuse me. My next change of assignment was to be assigned to the SWAT team. Again, they were moving positions around. I was only there a couple of years, and I then went upstairs to drive a desk as a detective. 3 years after that, they decided to put that position back on the SWAT team. I went back to SWAT. Total of a little over 8 years in SWAT altogether. After I left SWAT, I was back on patrol for a very short amount of time until I was recruited to go to the training academy and teach both recruits and seasoned police officers in use of force concepts and use of force skills.
Staton, you submitted a curriculum vitae to me in regards to your qualifications, correct?
As your request, yes.
And it would be Defense Exhibit number 41.
So labeled.
This has previously been admitted for record purposes, but so that we conserve time, I would offer State Exhibit 41 into evidence for all purposes. This goes through your training and experience and would prevent you having to list all of it.
Judge, at this time, I'm going to object to hearsay.
All right, the objection's overruled. What exhibit number is that, Ms. Madsen?
Defense Exhibit 41.
Defense Exhibit 41 is admitted.
Fair to say it's 9 pages, correct?
I assume so. I've seen it, and it's 8 or 9 pages. I don't remember.
And you've listed all the trainings you've gone to, all of the trainings you've conducted in the realm of your expertise, correct?
They should all be on there, yes. And if they're not, my wife's in trouble.
Okay. She does good work. We assume they're on there.
Yes, ma'am. I do too.
How did you become involved in this case?
You called me and asked me to review some material to see if I was interested in assisting you with presenting this case to the jury.
Have we ever met before, worked together?
Not before Tuesday of this week.
Tuesday of this week we met, correct?
That is correct.
But I contacted you before that.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
But when I first contacted you, that was our first contact.
Oh, I didn't understand the question. No, ma'am. Prior to your phone call, I didn't have any clue who you were.
And when I contacted you, did I give you a synopsis of anything? Did I give you my view of the case at all?
No, ma'am. You said you had an officer-involved shooting that you wished me to review, to see if I was interested in coming on board.
And what materials have you reviewed in this case?
Well, I've seen, like all of you have, and seen them again here, all of the videos, the officer body-worn camera videos, of the offense report, the statements that the officers made, and the witnesses, or witness, I believe there was only one. I have seen grand jury testimony transcripts. I have seen the computer-generated three-dimensional reenactments that depicted who was where and what the cars were doing and what the officers were doing. I have seen the immunity agreement that was signed by the
Objection,
past.
Your Honor, this witness is testifying to facts that are not in evidence.
Sustain.
Your Honor, may we approach?
Yeah, sure.
Members of the jury will disregard the last answer and question that was offered by this witness.
Go ahead, Ms. Manson.
Did you review all of the statements that would be in the Dallas Police Department file?
Yes, ma'am. If I reviewed everything that you sent to me that I think you represented was the complete file, so I assume the answer is yes.
And additionally, I would communicate with you of, is there anything else that you believe you need to look at, correct?
You asked me that, yes, and I believe I've included the vast majority of what I've reviewed in this case.
Have you, fair to say that you've looked at everything that you could?
Everything that I thought I needed to form an opinion that you were looking for in this case, yes.
And I didn't tell you what opinion I was looking for, did I?
No, ma'am.
I asked you to let me know if you had formed any opinions, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And have you formed any opinions?
Yes, ma'am.
And what are those opinions?
It is my opinion after reviewing the material that I just discussed that Officer Hess on the night in question followed his training and experience as a seasoned police officer and did an exemplary job of doing the best he could to keep from using force on that night. That when he did eventually use force, it was in good faith and it was what he did was reasonable.
And you said that what he did was reasonable that night.
I believe the force he used was reasonable, yes, ma'am.
Let's go into kind of why you rendered that opinion, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
What is reasonable? What viewpoint is Texas going to require that you look at it from?
Well, Texas is going to require that an ordinary, prudent person under the same circumstances would likely have done what the defendant, Officer Hess, did in this case.
How do you approach it?
Well, I start from the foundation where the use of force began, which is the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment.
The Constitution of the United States and the Fourth Amendment.
Yes, and I would say that there was a time when I would have started with the 14th Amendment, but I don't think we want to go down that road. It changed in the middle of my career. So yes, the Fourth Amendment.
But then you work to what the Texas standard and definition of reasonable person is.
Yes.
And a reasonable person would be an ordinary, prudent person in the same circumstances as the defendant.
It is, but also understand that means that you have to take into account that Officer Hess was called to that scene and he was there legally and he actually had a duty to be there, and you have to take into account his training and you have to take into account his experience. And I think we're going to get into it in more detail. You also, in order to give a fair judgment or render a fair opinion, have to understand some of the limitations that human beings are saddled with, particularly in stressful situations.
Okay, so you were considering the fact that he's a police officer and what his training would have been. This is going to be somebody who is situated like him. That's a part of the factor.
Yes. Now, to be fair, I don't know exactly every element of his training, but I'm very familiar with what the standard training would be for a police officer, certainly what the minimum standards are to be able to obtain a certification under TCLOS, the state body that issues those. And so I feel I have a very solid foundation for doing what I did, which was rendering an opinion.
And you look at the totality of the circumstances?
Yes, but understand that's the totality of the circumstances as perceived by that ordinary prudent person at the time, not what we have later come to learn was the historical accurate situation. So everything, well, no, you can't get into the officer's mind, but you want to know what he had available to know at the time that he made the decision.
Totality of the circumstances is one of those legal terms, but fair to say you break it down of before, during, and after.
Yes, the before and during is the most important, but the after is not irrelevant.
Let's start with before. We consider why he's there, don't we?
Yes, he's there because he has a duty to be there. He's responding to a call from 911.
And what was important about what happened before? Right when he, I guess, just walk me through his interaction with time. What was of note?
Where do you want me to start now?
Wherever you think you need to start.
Well, he started by getting the call that there was a suspicious vehicle and the information that he received that this was reported to be a stolen vehicle, so he had to assume that it was. The fact that the call sheet indicated that there were two people possibly occupying said vehicle, and that as he arrived that there were multiple other officers already on scene, and that the situation that they were forced to deal with was confining because of the limitations of space. You've heard several officers up here testify about doing I think they said it wasn't exactly a felony traffic stop, but it was a sort of a modified. So they had to work with the situation they had. Do you want me to continue with narrative, or do you want to ask more specifics?
Where did you go from there?
Okay, so after understanding the foundation of why we're there and what we're doing, I looked at the length of time and the number of attempts that and the effort that they put into trying to resolve this peacefully by getting what police officers always want, which is volitional compliance.
What about their efforts? Did their efforts seem appropriate?
I would say under the circumstances they were forced to operate under, they were not out of the norm for police officers in that situation.
Reasonable?
Yes.
Giving the occupants of that car every opportunity to comply?
That is correct.
Making efforts to identify themselves?
Frequently, loudly, and repeatedly.
Why is that important?
Again, they have to be there. They can't just leave. They don't want to go up to the car because they perceive this is a stolen car and that it was last reported to have occupants. There is a significant risk that the people in that car would not respond favorably if they just walked up to the car. They wanted to peacefully resolve the situation that they were confronted with.
And tell me what's important about how long the commands go on?
Well, it's important because you've heard several questions about why did they rush up to the car. Well, they kind of really didn't rush up to the car. They tried repeatedly to get a response from the car, and then I think probably out of maybe a little frustration, they started moving closer, trying to well, maybe from back here, maybe it's not working, but maybe if we get a little closer. That does increase the risk to them, but they were running out of options. There was a long time.
Now, you said a couple of things. They're expected to be there. They can't just leave. Why can they not just leave?
That's their duty as a police officer to resolve this problem that they've been given.
That a citizen's called with an issue, it's their duty to investigate and deal with it.
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
And you don't believe there was a rush in their decision-making?
Well, you can always look back in hindsight and say, well, they could have taken more time. They could have done this. They should have done that. It certainly didn't appear to be rushed. There was some communication between the officers at one point. Well, there's probably nobody in it. Let's just go up and look. But other officers on scene with perhaps more experience or second thought said, well, wait a minute. Let's wait. Maybe that's not the best approach. And by the way, that's when the most senior officer on the scene, if I believe I'm correct when saying that, Officer Hess, said, well, let's at least bring he didn't say it, he just did it. He brought the patrol car up. So they had a better place from which to try to gain compliance from the occupants.
And once they get closer to the car and are trying to gain compliance, tell me about the tension in that situation. We see the officers get closer and back up multiple times. Why are they doing that?
Well, because of this ongoing realization that the threat is real, they had to know that with the volume and the frequency that they were trying to get some kind of compliance out of the occupants, particularly once they discovered that there were, for a fact, occupants in the vehicle, their stress levels going up. That's human nature under the circumstances.
What kind of stress is that going to have on the body?
Well, I could go into more detail than any of you would probably want to hear, but there are a number of changes that start taking place when you realize that you put yourself in a position where serious bodily injury or death could occur if you do it wrong. It's frequently known as survival mode, or you may recognize it as fight or flight syndrome. There's a number of different terms used to describe this phenomenon. The more specific is sympathetic nervous system activation. I said I wouldn't get too technical, but it's a significant change that is inherent in all human beings, and it can't be trained out of you just because you're a police officer.
And I mean, there's no way to know who was going into this survival mode at what moment, is there?
Nor can I tell you any individual out there at what degree, because this is something that it actually start out on a lower scale, and as the stress rises, your stress can rise. It can go all the way to where you literally can't function. It's referred to sometimes as condition black. So to be more specific, no, I can't tell you which officer was stressed or how stressed. I can only tell you that it would be normal for officers in that situation to in some way have an elevated stress level or threat indication from watching the videos and reading the reports.
But it's fair to say that as this situation goes on, the tension is escalating as well as the threat.
Again, the tension will sometimes go up, sometimes it'll come back down a little bit, but the longer it goes on, the more likely that they're going to be more stressed.
When do you believe, do you believe the occupants begin to show any force or aggression?
Well, the first true indication of resistance or aggression from the occupants of the vehicle is when it started. Now, it is possible they were doing that to roll down the windows. You heard testimony to that effect. But since the windows didn't come down, very quickly after it started and the brakes came on, I think it became clear that the vehicle's fixing to move. And here's where we have a big problem.
Okay.
You can't really control a situation until you're able to keep it from going mobile. That car could start and move at any time. The obvious solution to that problem was they were not allowed to use, because Dallas Police Department has a policy that says you can't pull your car up and block another car. Well, that may be a good or bad policy, I don't know, but it certainly took that option off the table. If they'd been able to do that, then the car could never have moved, and they could have slowed down and gone to plan B, or they could have done a number of different things, but you don't have that ability until you're able to immobilize the situation and control it. They weren't in control.
Okay, so let's go back. When Officer Hess pulls the car up to provide cover, it would have been safer for everyone if he could block the car in and they couldn't go mobile.
Yes, it would have been safer for everyone, the occupants of the car as well as everyone on the scene.
But for whatever reason, I guess you've expressed some frustration about this policy.
I have a huge issue with that policy, which is not uncommon, particularly with large agencies throughout Texas and probably across the country, because it puts the risk to the citizens in the community and the officers at a higher level than a risk of potential injury to a car. It just doesn't make sense to me. Of course, I'm not the one making the policy, so.
So Officer Hess is not allowed to block the car in because it can damage the car. So that is taken out of his toolbox. So you see him pull up a little.
Yes, when the lights came on, and you can hear him make an expletive on the video, That's because from training experience, he knows this isn't getting better, this is getting
Doesn't object
worse.
to speculation at this point in time as to what the defendant may have known at that moment.
All right, the objection sustained. Just confine it to what you've been able to observe and not things that are going on in somebody else's head.
I'm trying, sir. So from the actions that I observed on the video, it is apparent that the officer decided to get in the car and pull up and try to limit he tried to do something which was obviously to try to limit the amount of room that the car had to maneuver.
And we've heard Officer Alish describe it as things were about to get out of control.
Yes, we have another term for it in law enforcement, but I don't think it's appropriate to use here.
Okay, I don't know this term.
Okay.
But at that moment, it seems clear that Officer Hess is physically reacting to this escalation.
That's what I believed from watching the videos and reading all the statements, yes.
Then what else is important about his behavior at that point?
About Officer Hess specifically?
Yes.
He was still doing what he was trained to do, which is to attempt to try to bring some control to what's about to be a potentially chaotic scene.
And the vehicle is something they're trained to use for cover for officers that are on foot?
Yes, if you've got a vehicle that is either mobile or potentially mobile, then if you can put a police car or some other significant object between you and that car, then yes, that would be cover from the car. Wouldn't necessarily be cover from gunshots that could have come out of the car, but it's better than nothing.
And then how about the officers are testifying and they're saying they don't know where each other are? Tell me about that. Why is that happening?
Well, I think you've heard several people, several officers who were on the scene discuss the fact that once the car started moving and they knew there were people in there who were trying to do something, the threat level raised and they were focused on the car because that's where the threat is. Now, there is an unrealistic expectation on the part of many people who don't understand some of the things that I do that, well, you're going to be able to keep up with everybody in your peripheral vision. Under stress, you lose your peripheral vision. And you've heard people talk about tunnel vision. Even when you're not under stress, human beings don't have really great peripheral vision. I think I'll stop there. But.
Well, basically, there's a ton of science behind this, right?
Oh, there is significant science behind it. You may have heard a couple of people mention force science. They didn't invent this idea or this concept.
What is force science?
Force science is nothing more than a training institute that is manned by a long list of people who are at the top of the food chain in their particular field that has led the way in doing research that is conducted under the scientific method, that is peer-reviewed, that is generally accepted within the community of being supportive of what these human limitations are.
Okay, so there is science that backs up these human limitations, but kind of what you're saying is human limitations under these stressful situations has been well researched. Well researched,
and I think critical in determining the facts that you or the opinion that you wish me to render in this case.
Well, let's start with, is tunnel vision real?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, and why is it important here?
Well, it's extremely important here because you're asking Officer Hess to do something that, if he was stressed, and we don't know what level of stress, but if he was stressed, would be impossible for him to do. Even under no stress, it would be very difficult to do, to keep up with 6 different people in this situation that is tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving.
And this situation is happening in a matter of seconds. We have heard questions asked about he would have just turned his head and looked. Is that a reasonable thing to expect an officer to do in those moments?
It's not reasonable. Is it possible? Yes. Is it highly unlikely that under those circumstances that a normal police officer or a normal prudent person would have done that? No.
Why?
No, because you can't train out thousands or millions of years of evolution. But what we're talking about here is when this occurs in people, this stress change, you're not operating under the normal logical thought process like we're doing in here. We've got all the time in the world. We're under no stress, right? We can logically weigh options and come up with the best one. As you get more and more stressed, that part of the brain actually relinquishes control to the part of our brain that is more attuned to all animals. That's the survival mode thing kicking in. If you don't have the time to judge all of these options in your forebrain, in this part, excuse me, this part of your brain, and you have to do something right now, this isn't the part of the brain that is driving the boat. It's the midbrain.
And then in discussing we are talking about whether or not he should have known where all those officers are. Is he trained to keep his focus entirely on the threat?
He's trained to observe the situation and deal with it. As the threat level rises, it becomes more and more difficult to take your focus off of the threat. And it gets to the point, and again, it's the explanation of the tunnel vision. You're not seeing this, you're seeing this. This is what is important, what you're actually looking at. And so I would be surprised if the officers on scene were all able to look around and see where everybody was. And now, not during the entire event.
Judge, I'm going to object to narrative at this point.
All right, go ahead and ask your next question, please. Go ahead.
You wouldn't expect them to know during the event. What do you mean?
Well, where I was going is I wouldn't expect them not to look around when the car wasn't moving and when they were still trying to get compliance. Once the car started moving and the threat level rose and the amount of time they had to do whatever they were going to do, you have less and less time. They don't have the ability to go back and look at videos and stop and analyze, right? We do
Like
here.
we did here.
Yes, like everyone here has done for the last 4 days. So there's a time crunch, and there's also, as I didn't get into it, but there's time distortions that come along with the stress.
And then talking about distortions, tell me about the officers have all said it seemed like it was moving much faster than when I watched the video.
Okay, so part of that can be time distortion. Part of that can also be just perception of movement under stress is more difficult. People aren't very good at judging speed and distance already. Put them under stress, they're even less good at it. And I think it is significant to note that a number of the officers and the civilian witness said it seemed in real life like
Objection,
the
Your
car...
Honor, to hearsay.
The objection sustained.
Would you be surprised that people think that it seemed like it was going faster?
No, that would be normal.
But when we watch these body cameras specifically, let's talk about body cameras and how they're going to distort what the jury sees.
So body cameras are specifically designed to take in
Judge,
as...
I'm going to object to this. This witness was not qualified as an expert to go into this line of testimony.
All right, just, the objection's overruled.
Go ahead and answer.
I understand. And I did help, well, that's irrelevant. So body cameras have been designed with the help from police officers as to what they need to do, and they take in a wide field of vision, wider than a human being. Those cameras could have had a very narrow focus, or they could have had a very wide focus. They could also be, if the people who make the cameras, one of them too, they could see at night where we could not. There's all kinds of capabilities that a camera may have that the human eye doesn't have. But the big one is, in a body-worn camera, everything is in focus. When you're under stress, this out here is not. Your peripheral is not in focus. It's right here.
So the body camera will be a wider lens in showing more than maybe the person will.
It does, and when you do that, you distort distances because you're not getting a clear picture of how far it is from point A to point B. From where the camera is to where it's taking the image.
And in order to, so basically on the body cam, it may appear slower than the actual speed would appear if you were standing there.
Yes, but that's because, again, it's the human being's perception of speed rather than the actual speed and our inability to measure speed.
Let me talk about, so is there anything else that you think is important from the moment the car turns on to when it hits the police car?
Well, I think it's important to note that no one out there fired, which they should not have done, because even though the car was then moving, when it just backed into the police car, there was no one that was in an imminent threat of being injured. And I would also say that when it pulled forward into the fence, same situation. No one fired because they weren't justified in firing. There was no reason to believe anyone was in imminent or immediate threat of being injured.
How about the moment it goes into reverse? Does the situation change at that point?
It only changed when it became obvious that the car was no longer going to ram or bump into the police car again, but that it was going to try to avoid the police car, and that it was headed in the direction that more than one officer on scene thought police officers were still there. That's the huge change.
And is that change reasonable?
Oh, absolutely.
Why?
Because they're human beings, and we've, I think, covered why that it would be unreasonable for them to be able to keep up with where everybody was, and it would be reasonable for them to believe that someone who was there a second or two ago was still there and could get pinned or hit or whatever by the car.
How about the moment shots start? There are 2 volleys of shots, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Talk to me about those.
So a police officer is trained, if he deems that he is justified in doing so, to shoot until the threat has stopped. That's exactly what Officer Hess did.
Okay, are you concerned about the number of shots?
I'm not, and I realize it looks bad. Okay, but we're not judging the police officer by whether or not his actions look bad.
What do you mean looks bad?
Well, it just looks bad. Well, did you have to shoot him so many times? That's a common thing that you'll hear from people who have witnessed a police shooting. I would expect the average police officer under stress, situational, to be firing between 3 and 5 rounds per second, depending on the firearm that he's using.
3 to 5 rounds per second. Why?
Because you want to stop the threat. And also, unlike the unrealistic expectation that many people who are not trained or not knowledgeable about this topic, all they've known is what they see on TV and the media, and the good guy shoots the bad guy one time and it's over. That's not real. There have been numerous instances where suspects, particularly with drugs in their system, have been shot 10, 15, 20 times, and they were still a threat. They were still continuing to return fire and or be a threat. So you don't just shoot and hope that one shot will work, or 2 or 3. You start putting rounds towards the target, and when the car stopped, the officer stopped shooting, right? That's what he's trained to do. When the car started moving again, he resumed shooting. When it was obvious that the car was going to stop, he stopped shooting. It's not pretty to look at, but it's real versus fantasy.
And it's real based on his training.
Training and experience.
And is it reasonable to shoot that many times?
Situationally. Now, if he were standing in a crowd of people, no. You've heard this too, you do have to be aware of what's between you and a target, what the target is, and what the backstop is. Where are those bullets likely to end up? So if there were a crowd of people behind this car, it wouldn't have been reasonable for him to shoot at all.
You've heard questions.
I'm sorry, when I say behind the car, I mean in line with where he's shooting, not behind where the car is going.
Okay, behind his line of fire.
Yes, in his line of fire.
You've heard questions about shouldn't he have known, wasn't he shooting in the direction of the officers? Did you believe he was reckless when he was shooting at the officers? Is that what you observed?
No, I don't. From looking at all of the information I had available to me, where he last saw the officers, he would not have been shooting at them. Now, if he had continued shooting as the car came to a stop, he could potentially have been shooting where he last saw them.
But you believe that he, I guess, gauged those distances reasonably?
That's a really tough one for me to answer. I believe that he did what he was trained to do, that he identified the threat, that he put rounds on threat until the threat stopped, and I find that to be reasonable.
Tell me about his behavior after. What's significant of that?
I find his behavior to be exemplary. He's
Judge, I'm going to object right now. I believe that this witness was qualified to discuss the reasonableness of the defendant's actions at the moment that he used force.
Sustained.
You've said that you looked at his behavior before, during, and after to judge reasonableness. Did you look at how he behaved after?
And Judge, I'm going to renew my same objection. We're here at the moment, at the time that this defendant fired his deadly weapon into Mrs. Dawes' vehicle. That is precisely what this trial is about, not what happened after he fired.
Objection sustained.
Did Officer Hess seem to be in control of the scene?
Well, he couldn't be in control of much of it because the occupants of the vehicle are in control. But as far as what he was able to control, yes, before, during, and
Before, during, and the after.
after.
Okay, and we have heard about all the multiple officers saying that afterwards, they never thought to do some of the things that Officer Hess did. Why is it reasonable that their brain would be in a different place than his?
Judge, I'm going to object to this. This witness isn't qualified to talk about the reasonableness of another officer's actions that night or any other witness. He's here to talk about the defendant's actions.
Are you talking about immediately after the shooting when he's calling for the paramedics? All right, I'll overrule that objection. Go ahead.
We're really talking about the difference in experience. So, experienced officer did what he, and Officer Hess did what he was trained to do, and realized that after the shots were fired, there were certain things that still needed to be done. I am not overly surprised that other officers hadn't got there yet, and the difference is experience.
And that would be why he would immediately after is able to call for help, but still keep an eye on the threat.
He was still keeping an eye on a threat. He was doing everything you would expect a veteran, seasoned officer to do. He was calling for backup. He was calling for ambulance. Y'all know all of this. You've seen it. All right? But that's what a good officer should do.
We have heard multiple officers talk about that they believed their fellow officers were behind that car, but they couldn't say who was there. Is that something that you consider?
Yes.
Why?
Because it goes back to the multiple people moving in a situation that is becoming more tense, and it goes back to the human limitations. It's just very hard to keep up with who is where, and when they start moving around and you're trying to focus on the threat. Unrealistic expectations to think that everybody can keep up with where everybody else is.
Who was in control of how that scene evolved?
Well, again, the person most in control was the driver of the vehicle. Secondary to that was the passenger in the vehicle, either one of which could have reduced the tension and the threat level by exhibiting their hands, putting down the windows, coming out of the car, or saying that, giving some explanation as to why they weren't, doing something. As far as being in control of the other officers who were there and how to best approach this, Officer Hess was in more control than anybody else.
And after all of this, after the shots were fired and the vehicle stopped, did Officer Hess seem to react like there was still a threat?
Yes.
Okay. Why is that important?
Again, due to his experience, he realized just because we have a driver who is no longer appears to be a threat, we have a passenger who's been removed from the car, we still don't know what's in that car, we still haven't cleared it. Once again, his experience and training has risen to the level of what you want a good officer to do.
And we see him reminding the other officers of that?
Yes, we do.
Why is that important?
It's important because that's what he needs to be doing as a leader out there. He needs to be not only making sure that what he's doing is as safe as possible, but trying to take care of his fellow officers. The threat wasn't over, although we now know that it was. At the time, they didn't know that.
In viewing everything about this scene, all of the body cameras, all of the statements, all of the testimony you've heard today, you believe that Officer Hess behaved reasonably that day?
I believe that Officer Hess followed his training and his experience to a T and absolutely did what a reasonable officer would have done, and actually other officers out there said they would have done if they had a clear shot. So yes, unequivocally, that is my belief.
Ask the witness.
Cross-examination?
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Now, we met yesterday, but my name is Mashika Nicholson, and I'm going to be asking you a couple questions, okay?
Yes,
If you
ma'am.
don't understand something that I've asked you or you need me to repeat it, just let me know.
Yes, ma'am.
So I want to pick up where we just left off. You just testified before this grand jury that you believe that the defendant's use of force was reasonable because it would be what another reasonable officer would do. Isn't that correct?
And in addition to that, I also followed the
I'm
penal
sorry,
code, but
sir.
that's what I just
My
testified.
question was, is that what you just testified to?
To this jury, not
To
grand
this
jury,
jury.
yes, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. What exactly, what section of the penal code are you relying on when you're making a determination for this defendant's use of force, whether or not it was reasonable?
Chapter 9, but I couldn't give you the exact number.
Okay, and what does it actually state within Chapter 9?
And again, I can't quote it I can read it, which is what lawyers and police officers do when they need to refresh their memory. Go back and read it and get real comfortable with it, but I can't recite it. I'm just not that good.
Okay, well, let me ask you this next question. You said how many years of law enforcement have you had, sir?
So I'll just briefly, 25 years as a police officer, a little over 25, and I've been teaching police officers since, and then stumbled into doing this expert witness work. So I have 45 years if you want to put it all together.
45 years.
Yes,
Thank you,
ma'am.
sir. And within your 45 years of law enforcement experience, how many times were you the lead detective in an officer-involved shooting investigation?
Never.
So you've never been a lead detective in an officer-involved shooting investigation?
No, I don't teach investigations. I teach use of force and use of force skills. I don't try to teach officers how to do an investigation.
What is your understanding of what an officer-involved shooting investigation entails?
Well, it's extremely complex, and as I'm sure that the jury must know that these days you have to preserve the scene correctly, you have to collect the evidence correctly, you have to interview witnesses correctly. There's a long list. It is a complicated issue, and it's also not an investigation, it's multiple investigations. There's an investigation for the criminal aspect. There's an investigation for the, there's an investigation for the internal, whether they're following policy. And some agencies, including Austin, there's also an investigation to see whether the officers were following training. We actually had
So that's correct, and so it's a lot, it's a very complex investigation.
It is extremely complex and takes a lot of man-hours.
A lot of man-hours. Well, and then let me go to this. I know that you stated that your belief that the defendant's actions was reasonable is because he is trained and he followed his training as a Dallas police officer. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
All right. And you also, I know because you stated that you've listened to the other witnesses and the other officers that have taken the stand, and you talked a lot on direct examination about the limitations for human performance. Is that correct?
I did, yes.
Testimony was?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but yes, ma'am, that is correct.
Thank you. But you were also present to see that there are other Dallas police officers that were also on the scene that night, and that they were able to manage the scene. They were able to look over and take note of where other officers were at the time. Are they not also under the same human performance expectations that this defendant is?
All human beings have the same limitations. They affect some people more than others.
And
But
then, I'm sorry, sir.
I wasn't quite done, may I?
I would ask that she allow the witness to answer.
You can finish answering.
However, this took a very long time, and I think you will recall, folks, that most of the officers were able to say where one or two or three other officers were. I don't remember anybody who said he was able to keep up with all six all during the event. Does that answer your question, ma'am?
It really didn't, but that's okay, sir.
Would please ask it again, and I will try to answer it better.
Well, I've got another one for you.
Yes, ma'am.
Based on the training that all Dallas police officers receive, did you not hear that they are trained to get out of the way of a moving vehicle?
Absolutely. Not only is that training, but that's common sense.
Exactly. But you also, according to the Dallas Police Department's general orders, rules, policies, and their training, that they would believe and expect another officer to get out of the way of a moving vehicle.
Yes, and I think I would also say I would think anybody would expect anybody, if they see a car coming at them, they're going to get out of the way.
Exactly. And didn't you also, when it comes to firing into moving vehicles, that is prohibited from the Dallas Police Department? Did you hear that as well?
I understand the policy, it does have exceptions, but yes.
And also, when it comes to that policy, sir, well, I guess what is your understanding of the Dallas Police Department's use of force policy when it comes to firing at moving vehicles?
It's very similar to almost all the police department policies I've seen that have that restriction that says, don't put yourself in the line of the moving vehicle to justify being able to shoot at it. If you can, get out of the way. But if that's the only recourse you have, and I'm obviously not quoting it verbatim, that you can use deadly force to the driver of a vehicle if they are an imminent threat to you or someone else. Unless you, again, you can't put yourself in the line of the car to justify that.
And, sir, what is the danger of shooting at a moving vehicle?
Oh, there are numerous dangers. The danger is, number one, that you hit the driver and the driver goes on to do something worse than what they were doing to begin with. That's possible, depending on the situation. Possibility that you miss and that there's something that you weren't aware of that was behind that vehicle. There's a possibility of a ricochet off of the vehicle. It's not a safe situation.
Yes, sir. And I know that are you here to tell this jury, do you know what the defendant thought or felt at the moment in time that he used force?
No, ma'am. There's no way I could know that.
Do you know what the defendant believed in that moment?
Do I know what he believed? No, ma'am.
Do you know what he believed?
No, ma'am.
Do you know what the defendant could actually see with his eyes at that moment?
I know what he should have been able to see, but I can't tell you what he was focused on. It appeared he was focused on the car. How wide of a focal screen he had? No, I can't know that.
Okay. And so you don't know what the defendant's peripheral vision is, do you?
I don't know what it was, but I would be shocked if he was able to focus on, well, no, I would be shocked if any human being can focus on one thing and really give any details as to what's going on outside their peripheral vision if they're under stress.
So, sir, I don't think that answered my question. Do you know what this defendant's peripheral vision was at that time?
I thought I said no, and I will repeat, no, I do not.
Thank you. And I believe that you also stated that based on common knowledge and practices as far as training, what are officers taught when it comes to firing their firearm? What are some of the basic principles when it comes to shooting your firearm as a police officer?
Some of the basic principles are that if you have a weapon, it's a loaded weapon until you've proven that it isn't. And if you decide to use that weapon in defense of yourself or someone else, that you need to be justified. If you're going to do that, you should be able to know that it is safe to do so in as much as possible, that there isn't something between you and the target that you don't want to hit. And again, situationally, if possible, that there isn't something immediately beside or right behind the target that you might hit unintendedly.
And what is target sight?
Target sight?
Yes.
Sight picture?
That as well.
Okay, so when you're shooting a firearm, if you're shooting strictly for accuracy and you want the bullet to go to a very specific place, you have sights at the rear of the gun that look kind of like this. You have a sight at the front of the gun that looks kind of like this. You want to line those up on the target and then press the trigger. Unfortunately, that's 3 different things that are in your sight picture and you can only focus on one of them.
And did you hear throughout the course of the testimony in this trial that other officers stated that they didn't fire because they didn't have a target sight?
Yes, what I understood them to say is they did not have
Sir, I'm sorry, my question was, did you hear them say that?
I apologize, I did.
Thank you. Isn't it also true that Dallas police officers, that they're trained, not only do you need to know what your target sight is, you also need to be mindful or take into consideration the backdrop?
The backstop would be more accurate, but yes.
And that you also need to be aware of the surroundings.
As much as humanly possible under the situation, that's true.
And that if you are shooting into a moving vehicle and you don't have a target sight, isn't it true that you're just shooting blindly and that in and of itself is not how officers are trained to shoot their firearms?
It's certainly not an ideal circumstance. I can't disagree with what you just said.
And sir, in your review of the materials, is there, any indication that the gun that was found in that suspect vehicle had any bearing on this defendant's use of force?
That's a pretty broad question. I would certainly say that he had no way of knowing the gun was there.
And so let me.
So I would agree. I just had to think about it. I would agree with your statement.
Okay, and so that's no, that gun in the vehicle had nothing to do with the defendant's decision to use deadly force against Ms. Dawes.
I would agree with that.
And sir, as an expert, how much do you expect to be paid for your work that you performed on the defense for this trial?
I normally charge $100 an hour for preparing for trial and $1,000 a day to testify.
And so what do you estimate that your final bill will be?
Okay. As I told you yesterday, I thought it was going to be around $5. I think after getting the hotel bill, which is crazy in Dallas, closer to $6,000.
$6,000. I'll pass the witness.
Ms. Mattson?
Mr. Staton, the DA cut you off when she was asking you about the question about what officers said about their target site. What did you understand them to actually be saying?
Sight picture.
Yes.
Do you want more?
Were they saying they didn't have a sight picture, or what were they talking about?
They didn't have a clear line of sight. They didn't have a clear shot. It was too risky for them to try to shoot from the position they were to where the vehicle was.
What was the reason they gave?
Well, different people give different reasons, but essentially it was they didn't have a clear shot. And the one officer who did shoot, if I may continue, quickly realized he probably shouldn't have shot either, because Officer Hess was really in a dangerous position from where he was to where the vehicle was.
And some of them talked about being on the line. What is the line?
When they're referring about being on the line, that's where most of their training occurs, is they're actually abreast of each other so that everybody's shooting from the same plane. And so when they were approaching the vehicle, they were trying to maintain the line so no one was out in front, where if shots had to be fired, that you would be shooting past your officer, which, again, you don't want to do that.
And some of these officers talked about not shooting because they weren't on the line.
Yes, they were behind another officer, or another officer was in front of them. That's what they're talking about.
But those officers did say, had they been online and had they had a clear sight, they would have shot.
At least two others besides the two that did, yes.
And the DA talked to you about whether or not the gun was part of Officer Hess's decision to pull the trigger. We talk about a totality of the circumstances. Is the gun something to consider in the totality of circumstances?
I think more importantly would be from his experience that Officer Hess thought that with a stolen vehicle and a lack of cooperation.
Judge, I'm going to object to speculation as to what this defendant thought.
The objection is overruled. You can answer that question.
I could probably say it better, but a reasonable officer in Officer Hess's position would likely have considered that under those circumstances there could be a gun. Now again, he didn't know it was there, but they were treating this stop as if the people in that stop could have a gun. And we know the tragic ending, that if the guns are there and rounds start flying, because they can see the officers and the officers can't see them.
And again, who was in control of this scene?
Primarily the driver, secondarily the passenger, and much less so the officers who were present.
And as this scene escalates and escalates, isn't it completely reasonable for officers to think there's got to be something bad in that car?
Judge, I'm going to object to speculation as to what officers thought. And it's leading.
The objection's overruled. You can answer that question.
Isn't it completely reasonable as this goes on and the people in that car do not comply, that they have motivation and there must be something bad in that car.
I'm sorry,
No.
that was beyond the first question. The question was, as the scene escalates, is it reasonable for officers to think there's something bad in that car? And that's a yes or no question.
Yes.
All right, I'm not gonna let anybody speculate about motivations. Go ahead.
And as the scene escalates and the occupants of the car fail to comply, is this a situation where the threat increases with the driver's actions?
Yes.
Hessler.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, very good. Need you to stay there because I have
Yes,
a
sir.
question for you.
Yes, sir.
Members of the jury, if you would please go with the sheriff and await further instructions. All rise for the jurors. Y'all may be seated. The question was asked, what materials have you reviewed in this case? And one of your answers began with videos, grand jury transcripts, 3D drawings, what officers were doing, and then you said you have seen the immunity agreement. Did anybody tell you not to talk about the immunity agreement?
No, sir. I don't
Were you
recall
in-
anybody saying don't talk about it.
Were you in court when I told them that that evidence was inadmissible?
I believe I remember you saying, and I could be wrong, that it was only admissible for record but not for general, so the jury doesn't get to see the document.
So then why did you say that?
I was trying, I apologize, I didn't mean to mess up. I was trying to give everything that I had seen that I relied on in forming my opinion, and I screwed up.
When did you see the immunity agreement?
Well, I heard some testimony about it, I believe yesterday, but I actually didn't see the agreement until today.
All right. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Madsen, what do you intend to do now?
Your Honor, as we told the court, we have yet to be able to go through all of the body cams. The state has told me who the people are.
You need time to do that.
I need to talk to one officer, and then I need to watch 2 more of the videos. Of the 10, I've been able to watch 8, but I do need time.
I'm going to give you time. Court's going to be in recess until Tuesday morning at 8:30. That's all. Mr. Lehman, did you need me?
$37.